Hi, everybody. My name is Ilya. Um I am a mobility planner. I plan transportation, and I think that uh, in the room full of transit map designers and people who feel like those, there should be somebody who can talk about the very subject the maps are designed for. So we're going to be talking today. The title of this presentation is Behind the Map. Uh, and we're going to be talking today about public transit. There's a small disclaimer I need to make for the purpose of this specific event. I am not a graphics designer. For that reason, some graphics you're about to see may make your eyes bleed. I'm really sorry about that. So everybody knows this stuff. This is the infamous London Tube map, and when Mr. Beck was designing this back in 1930s, he was trying to convey the message. He was trying to represent something that so many people needed to have represented. He was trying to represent something that was useful to many people. And his representation succeeded because, not only because it was graphically fancy, and not because it was stylish, not because it was clear, legible, and very simple in the end, but also because the thing that was represented was useful to just so many people, so many residents and visitors of London, and that's why this map has become an iconic graphics design object and an icon of public transportation all around the world. So we're going to be talking today about what's behind the map. We're going to be talking about why public transportation remains relevant to our cities and to our freedom. And we're going to be talking about how public transportation works and what we can do to make it better. So, opportunity. Long story short, many years ago, like thousands of years ago, someone might have lived in a forest alone, and this is ecological, this is really good for your carbon footprint and all that kind of stuff, but when you live in a forest alone, somebody may come sooner or later and eat you. So at a certain moment, people decided that it is more convenient to live together, not only because it was safer, but also because people, when they collaborate, they're able to create some useful stuff that they can exchange with other people that make some other useful stuff, and so on and so forth. And that's how cities were born. And the trend in urbanization, it has always been as long as humanity has been here. So people are moving to cities because cities have many people inside. People are moving in dense cities because density is what brings everybody together. And people are moving there because cities are the center for opportunity. Opportunities are in a city, and we need opportunities, and that's why we are here. So, talking about time, we have only 24 hours a day in our life. That is something that is very solid, is not going to change, and we have nothing to do about that. So if we divide this into our typical day, that would be more or less 8 hours a day to do our job, more or less 8 hours a day to sleep. Numbers may vary, but more or less the numbers are like that. And so we have the other 8 hours for the rest. What is it? The rest. The rest is our lives, you know. The rest is our hobbies, our relatives, our friends. And so when we are talking about transportation, we cannot deduce from the time we need to sleep. We cannot deduce from the time we need to work. So we have to deduce from the time that goes to everything else. And the more we are riding and the more we are driving, the less we have time for our lives. The less we have time to spend it with our friends, with our relatives, with our kids. And so eventually that's why everybody tends to be constantly pissed off about transportation, because transportation impacts on our lives so heavily and so drastically. Transportation defines what we can do with our lives and what we cannot do with our lives. So if we express this spatially, this looks like this diagram here. I'm sure most of the people in the room are familiar with the concept of an isochrone, but basically, if I'm in the middle of this yellow area, this diagram shows with these lines, with these blobs, how far I can get in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes. And essentially, as mentioned before, we have a very limited amount of time for traveling anywhere. And so whatever gets outside these blobs is the job that we are not going to take, is the shopping mall we are not going to go to do shopping, people we are not going to meet, people we are not going to marry. Everything that is not going to happen with us in our lives lies outside these blobs. So the smaller these blobs are, the less we have the opportunity. And so obviously we want to increase our opportunity in our lives, and there are two ways of doing it. So one is move faster. So we expand these blobs and we make them wider, and so we can cover more distance with the same amount of time, and so we have access to more features of the city. Or we can also increase density and enrich the environment. That's also a possibility. So you can build a denser city, you can build more stuff, more activities within the same amount of within the same blobs. And so in this way, you're also increasing the access, increasing the opportunity. But we as individuals, we cannot just, rebuild our city overnight. So essentially, we address ourselves normally to the first option. We are trying to move faster. And in our attempt to move faster, we use this very tool. I'm sure most of the people are aware, but just in case there's anybody who doesn't know, this is called a car. Is there anybody in the room who doesn't like cars? Like people who don't like cars. Oh, come on. Everybody likes cars. It's a comfortable way of moving around. It has music, air conditioning, all that kind of stuff. The only problem is there are things on this planet, there are things in this universe that work perfectly until everybody uses them. And as soon as everybody uses them, they stop working. And a car has the same feature. So I'm sure you all know this kind of diagram that you might have seen many, many times. This shows how much space do 60 people occupy on bicycles, on cars, on a bus. And we are often told that we're going to have some new technology that is going to improve drastically the performance of cars, or we're going to invent some sort of new type of vehicle or whatsoever. And this is going to help us to beat the congestion and to move around more freely compared to what we experience now. And so we are told that we're going to have electric cars that are going to solve the problem, and maybe soon we are going to ride Ubers, and this is definitely going to help us. Or eventually, we are now expecting the autonomous vehicle to come, the driverless cars, and they're definitely going to solve the problem. Oh, wait a minute. They're not going to solve the problem because there are still cars. And the problem that we are trying to solve is a problem that cannot be solved with the technology. It's a problem of space. Space in urban streets is limited, so we cannot do anything with that if we are still trying to stick with cars, because cars tend to occupy too much space per person traveling, and large things do not fit in small spaces. But if, for instance, it's a driverless bus, it's a completely different story, but it's not because it's driverless, it's because it's a bus, and a bus is much more space efficient. We have to keep remembering this because we are so often told otherwise. So as I said before, if everybody uses cars, we are kind of stuck in traffic. It's a typical condition of traffic in Moscow. You may see this is definitely Moscow. When cities first encountered this problem, it was a long time ago actually, and the first cities which encountered this problem were American cities. And so they tried to do this kind of stuff. I'm not sure. There are people from the United States in the room. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is Atlanta. I'm not 100% sure, but it doesn't matter really. The point is that this is what a typical large American city used to look like in 19th century, and the picture on the right is what happened pretty much after 1920s, 30s, 40s, when we got the affordable automobile, and so everybody started to try to drive around the city, and in our attempts to enable ourselves drive freely around our cities, we eventually started destroying the city. So we started in a certain way. We started to destroy our cities in order to save them. This approach doesn't work. And we also know these pictures, and this is many, many years ago, more than half a century actually. So we've been there already. And also this, and also this. And so we were trying to design our cities, as if we were designing our homes this way. So, long story short, each problem has its own solution. If we are talking about ecology, we are talking about electric vehicles. If we are talking about efficient use of labor, we are talking about driverless vehicles. But if we are talking about efficient use of space, we are talking about large vehicles. This is important. Now, many people, especially drivers, and vast majority of people are drivers, they tend to say, well, let's just add another lane and it's going to work. Well, the answer is that it's not going to work. And this is because there's, this kind of large elephant in the room of urban and transportation planning, a phenomenon every transport professional knows about but prefer to keep silent about, and most other people outside the industry do not understand. It's a phenomenon that is named induced demand. It is when it becomes easier, cheaper, and more convenient to do something for people of what they need to do, they do it more. And this is a phenomenon that goes much outside the transportation. It goes into economics and many other fields, and eventually biology, because species tend to spread around the area more as there's more resource to do so. So induced demand is a well-known phenomenon, and we did know this for for decades. Since at least 1962, we know that this problem applies to transportation. But a lot of transport professionals and urban professionals, and especially politicians, they still prefer to pretend this problem doesn't exist. And however, there is a means of transportation that works differently when it faces the induced demand. When we have the induced demand for cars, we expand roads, we get more cars, we get everything congested, and it's all screwed up, and we expand the roads once again, and it again gets congested, and so on and so forth. But when we are dealing with public transportation, the phenomenon of public transportation is that the more the demand, the more efficient it is able to work. Because you can expand it. It is expandable. It is scalable. It can go from a small bus to a large bus to tram, and eventually to the more upgraded form of tram, a light rail, and eventually you can build a metro and use the rail. And so you can move lots and lots and lots of people, like thousands of people, compared to a single vehicular lane that takes normally around 1,200 to 1,500 vehicles per hour in regular urban traffic. Numbers may vary depending on the exact design circumstances, but you kind of get the idea. And put more scientifically, basically that's the same story. We can see this diagram by Professor Vukan Vucic, famous scientist in the field of transportation. So this diagram shows that there are plenty of designs and plenty of technologies and plenty of options for any kind of design capacity, speed, performance, and also the investments and operating expense. So this is really public transportation is really a tool that can address this problem. And we know that eventually increasing opportunity requires as many people as possible be able to reach as many places as possible. And so the solution on a systemic scale is that we go for multimodal transportation. Multimodal transportation has been invented some time ago in order to address this problem of car-oriented development of cities, and in order to make cities livable, in order to keep cities fulfilled with opportunity, and eventually for everybody to be able to move around. So multimodal transportation, this is a brilliant picture from a very well-known book of NACTO, Urban Street Design Guide. I strongly advise you to get acquainted with this book if you haven't, because it's a really easy reading and a really nice thing. But basically, this is the primary concept of multimodal transportation. We have the pedestrians first, because in the end we are designing for people, and people have to be first. Also, everybody, whatever kind of mode of transportation we use, everybody is a pedestrian sooner or later. Even if you drive all around the city, eventually you're going to be a pedestrian when leaving your car, your parking garage, and going home. Then we go with the public transportation as the most space-efficient means of transportation, as the means of transportation that really opens up the city to everybody. And then we go with the transportation that is related to commercial activity, people doing business, deliveries, and many other services that are needed for the city and that the cities are for. And eventually, as a very last priority, we have people in private cars and motorcycles and other similar vehicles that are not that space efficient in moving people around. But we're not trying to say that we need to necessarily go car free, because cars work perfectly fine in environments that do not have urban density. So if you go outside the city, if you go to suburbs, if you go to rural areas, cars are perfect. Cars are really necessary for our mobility. The problem is that cars do not work in dense environments, and so in dense environments we need a different mobility strategy. Okay, sorted out. So now we're going to the other question. So how do we make public transportation useful? How do we make public transportation work? Essential components of every public transport system are three main components: the service, the infrastructure, and the finance. Finance is obviously important, and we're not going to talk about much about that in this presentation, but finance are really important because most public transport systems, when they're organized in an efficient manner, they do not cover their costs. They have to be subsidized. So most public transport agencies around the world, which do excellent job, they're subsidized because public transportation has to do a lot of things it cannot make money for, like working early hours, late hours, going to the areas where there are not so many people living, and so on and so forth. We're gonna be talking about that quite in a while, but basically that's why you need to subsidize that. So and then we have the other two components, service and infrastructure, and we tend to think that infrastructure is the most important part. We tend to think that we need to build this rail or this metro and we're going to sort out the problem. The problem is that infrastructure is a fixed cost. You pay a large amount of money, but just once, and then you get the thing built. The most important problem is that you need to run service. You need to have trains or buses running up and down whatever kind of infrastructure you've built. And this service costs money. And the service costs a lot. And this money over some time period is going to go well beyond whatever the price was for this kind of infrastructure. At the same time, the service is what allows us to move around in cities. Service is a set of lines connected, hopefully, into an integrated network, and the frequencies assigned to these lines, meaning how often the buses or any other mode of transportation, how often they go along these lines. And so service is effectively defining where we can actually go. Again, you can see an isochrone. It's another sort of isochrone, but it tells the same story. So it tells where can I go. And so these two maps, already we saw both of them during the previous day of these presentations. So these maps are showing the service. They're not showing what kind of mode of transport you're dealing with, because the mode of transport in the end is not the thing that matters. You know, it doesn't really matter whether you're traveling with a train or with a bus or with a ferry or with a monorail or with whatever kind of technology, as long as it is frequent, it brings you where you need to go, you're on time, and a reasonable standard of comfort is provided, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really matter whether it's a bus or a train. What matters is where the service goes and how often it does so. So what you see on the left is the Luxembourg map by Hugh, a brilliant one. I'm a large fan of that. And the one on the right is the Surface Public Transport Network map for Moscow, designed in 2016 by Konstantin Konovalov, who is unfortunately not here today. And these maps are showing service. So essentially, there's nothing that is going to tell you that, for instance, on this map, you have not only buses, but also trams and trolley buses. Also, nothing is going to tell you that this is not a metro, actually, apart from the fact that it says that this is surface transportation. If I were not to show the initial phrase over there, I could have told you this is a metro map, and you would have believed me. So, what is our desire? Our desire, essentially, in moving around, is to get from A to B. And now we're going to see the great PowerPoint animation that I did myself. So we need to move. We need to move from A to B, and this is what we need to. This is what we need to do. And the geometrical shape of this desire is a straight line. This is very important because geometrically, a straight line is always the quickest way to a destination. This is really important. And so there are two different concepts of moving around. When we're moving around with a car, the only thing that really matters is the speed. You know, we were driving fast, we were driving slow, we got stuck in traffic, it was slow, then we got released, it was fast. So we're talking about the speed primarily. We get out, the car is always nearby, people tend to park near where they need to go, they don't park, kilometers away. So the car is always somewhere nearby, you take a car, you drive it wherever you want to go, and you end up in your destination. So the only thing that really matters is speed. This is not how public transportation works, and this is what most people do not understand, but this is really crucially important to what we are talking about. So when we're riding public transportation, our trip looks like this. So we have several components of a successful or unsuccessful public transport trip. Walkability, linearity, proximity, and frequency. There are many more, but these are the most important. The important part is that when I get out from wherever I am right now, I need to walk to the nearest transit stop. Then I need to wait for the service to come. Then I take the service and I'm on the bus or on a train or whatever, and I go to the place where I need to change lines, because in large cities it is often that most rides require you change at least once. And so I arrive to the interchange station and I need to walk from one platform to another or from one stop to another stop, and then I need to wait again, and then I take the other bus or train, and then I go to the final station where I need to disembark, and then I get out, and then I have to walk to my destination. So all these times, all these idle times, off-board travel times taken together can easily be like 50 or 60 or 70% of the total travel time on public transportation. And we need to understand that this is how it works. And the most important component here is frequency, and frequency is what defines the quality of service and the usefulness of the service to every one of you. So let's try to understand the concept of frequency. We can understand the concept of linearity. We're going to be looking into that right in a while. We can understand the concept of walkability. I mean, we need to be able to walk to the stop. This is kind of obvious. The concept that we don't really easily understand, and some people do not really quite get, is frequency, because this is something that we are not used to when we are driving. So when we are driving, okay, I need to go, so I take the car. That's it. When we are dealing with public transportation, okay, I need to go. And then I go to the stop and I wait for the service, and then I take the service and go wherever I need to go. The problem is that when I need to go, I go to the stop and I realize that the service comes every 30 minutes. And then, let's reiterate this. The service is coming, let's say, 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock, 9:30, etc., regular intervals of 30 minutes. Now let's imagine we are talking that now is 8:01. So we go to the stop and we realize that we need to wait for the bus for 29 minutes before we can go. So this phenomenon of not being able to travel when I need to go is the phenomenon that is defined by the frequency of service. At the same time, the more frequency, the more we need the buses, the more we need the drivers, the more it costs to provide the service for public transportation. This is important to understand. Now a little bit about the linearity and proximity, and here we're getting closer to the stuff that you might have heard before already from other speakers. So normally, like a normal public transport service that goes from one place in the city to another place of the city, goes like that and then passes a lot of different things like residential, shopping malls, other activity centers, industrial areas. whatsoever. Everything generates and attracts passengers. In a large city, people need to go from everywhere to everywhere, whatever they need is, at almost any time of the day. The problem is when you start having your service going, with twists and turns in order to access that shopping mall over there that is a little bit far there, and that residential area that is a little bit far out over there. And so eventually you get a service that does all these twists and turns. The problem is that this negatively impacts on the ridership. Because if you're traveling from A to B, such service will take too much time for you to move around, so perhaps you won't take the public transportation, you will drive or walk, because this is effectively faster. So this kind of twists and turns in order to try to cover all the far corners of the city, this works against public transport ridership, this works against efficiency. Of course, if high ridership is the goal, we're going to talk about that in a while. So when we are talking about ridership, it means that we really need to have the high density around us. We need to have a lot of people, and the more there's an indicator that is named productivity. This means how many people we were able to serve with public transportation within an hour of driving. How many people boarded the bus within an hour of driving. So clearly, the more people we have around our bus stops, the more people are going to ride the bus. So the higher the productivity would be. The problem is that and this is also, again, a thing that not so many people understand. Public transportation as a product provides two completely different services, completely different types of services that contradict one to the other. So one is the service that is aimed for achieving high ridership. So imagine you were a business, whatever kind of business, you are trying to find a market that has as many potential clients of yours as possible. So if we bring this into a public transportation field, if I were a bus and I were to have people riding me, I would go to the areas where the people are as many as possible. So the most dense areas. However, cities are comprised not only with dense areas, but with some other areas, like something like this, where, a village that is far, far away, where a single old lady lives, and she needs access to the city. She needs to go to the city. She needs to see her friends. She needs to be able to go to visit the doctor or a theater or a shopping mall or whatever. And she lives alone in that faraway village. And we provide a bus service to that faraway village, not because we're aiming for the high ridership, because a single old lady cannot cause a high ridership. She's single. So we are providing a bus service here for the sake of some other purpose. And this is called coverage. And this is another type of service that we are providing, and the efficiency of the service cannot be evaluated based on how many riders we take, because ridership is not the purpose. This has to be understood. We are talking about the infrastructure, and infrastructure is also really important, not because it costs a lot of money and not because it can have trains running on it, on the rails or whatever. Infrastructure is important because it defines, and it can hardly be revised, it defines what public transportation is actually able to do. So let's start with the reliability issue. This kind of thing when you come to the bus stop and the bus is supposed to be coming in 2 minutes. It's not coming in 2 minutes, and 4 in 10 and 15, and eventually 3 buses in a while are coming to a bus stop, and known as bus bunching, and you are kind of pissed off because you are late and you cannot make it for a meeting or whatever. So this is the problem that is called reliability issue. And the issue of reliability comes when public transportation has to deal with the rest of the traffic. When public transport is running in mixed traffic, and when the traffic is as terrible as you may imagine Moscow traffic is, we have a small problem. The problem is reliability. So horizontal axis shows the hours of the day from 3 a.m. to the 3 a.m. next day, which is 27, and the vertical axis shows the travel time. And these diagrams shows travel times for tram running between Yauza River and Chistye Prudy metro station in Moscow, which is more or less 5 kilometers one way. So the red dots are showing an accumulated database of the travel times of each run of each tram running along this line before the tram tracks were separated from the traffic. So the tram was running in a mixed traffic with all the other cars, and the traffic was so bad it affected the tram in such a way that if you were to take this tram, you would have traveled at any time of the day some sort of random time between 20 minutes and 2 hours. Just note the red dots. You see the red dots are covering all the area at any taken hour. The red dots are covering all the area between 20 minutes of travel time and up to 2 hours of travel time and even more. So it is only after we separated the tram tracks with a curb from the general traffic, the trams were able to get their dedicated lane, and they began running at regular travel times of 20 minutes for these 5 kilometers. This is very important because not only because the infrastructure is so definitive to what public transport can do, but also because so many things and so many issues, especially in relation to infrastructure, are outside the scope of work of your public transport operator. So when you're blaming your bus driver that he is not driving up to a schedule, it's not his fault. It is because the external environment defines whether he can run up to a schedule or he cannot. Because you cannot schedule a public transport when you have such kind of unpredictability, unreliability. So essentially, there was a study in New York recently on Manhattan. They were studying the Manhattan buses, and they discovered that the slowest bus in New York manages to run slower than a running chicken. And a running chicken can achieve a speed of 10 miles per hour, which is pretty fast. So this is one of the dedicated lanes that we were able to introduce in Moscow back in 2016 when we were designing the new bus network. And this is the tram line that we were just talking about. You see, you just add a little bit of a curb and you protect the tram tracks from traffic, and trams are able to run up to a schedule. Road network. Road network may also prevent from running efficient public transportation. So you remember we were talking about linearity, and it is quite occasional that, some highway engineers come into play and they bring a new brilliant highway that perhaps will be completely useless because of induced demand. And so they bring a new highway that requires, right in, right out. You cannot cross the road at this place. You need to go elsewhere, make a U-turn and go back and proceed. So this is a problem that affects linearity. Road design has affected linearity in this case, which means that whoever was using the bus, it now takes them more time to get where they are going. This means that the ridership is going to start falling because driving is more convenient than taking a bus that does something like that. And to illustrate this problem, these are the examples from Moscow bus network before the 2016 revision. So we can see 3 types of public transport lines. So one public transport line is completely affected with this non-linear pattern of travel. It does a one-way loop around the Kremlin because it was forced to do so because the traffic arrangement around Kremlin until 2016 was requiring every bus to do this one-way loop around the Kremlin. So the bus was running from south, and this, these ridership figures, like the total amount of boardings and the lightnings during the day. And so we can see nice numbers here and really nice numbers here and really nice numbers here. This looks pretty healthy. This looks like a typical bus line in any dense city. But then we enter the city center, and we're right in front of the Kremlin. Moscow is 15 million people. We have 1.5 million people daily population inside the Garden Ring, so within this area. And so we enter the very city center, and we have 27 people per day boarding a bus. Clearly, there's some sort of problem. And the problem is that people need to get from A to B. The geometrical form of that desire is a straight line. People do not ride in circles, as obvious as this might sound. We can see the other line that goes one way along the Kremlin and the other way through the Boulevard Ring. So again, we can see this is a healthy pattern. This is not so healthy, you see. The numbers are much lower. And there's another line that goes the same segment, but 2 ways, like this, and we can see the healthy pattern. We can see lots of people boarding and alighting at every stop. This is what public transport is supposed to do. This is how a healthy public transport line looks like. And the most stupid bus service that we were dealing with was the one here. So let's see. Sorry for the Russian. I will explain everything. So let's see how the road network design affects the bus service. So the bus is kind of trying to get from here to here, and a straight line. It kind of tries to run a straight pattern. So historically, some time ago, when it was not affected by the road design, it used to be a useful line because it was doing a pretty straight pattern from somewhere here to somewhere here. But it cannot do it because the road network prevents it from doing so. So that when the buses go into the city center, there's a garden ring that doesn't have a traffic light here. The traffic light was removed in order to improve the circulation of cars, which is the wrong priority, as we now know. So the bus has to do the right turn, go there, make a U-turn, go back, and go into the city center, and then it proceeds along the boulevard ring, and it would have turned left, but there's a tunnel here, so the bus has to go into the tunnel, and it cannot turn left, so it has to proceed, and it goes like this, into this direction. In the other direction, it goes like this. There is no left turn here, so it has to proceed and takes the first left turn available, goes here, and again, it would have turned right and left in order to go like this, but then there's the garden ring problem, so it would have had to turn right and go more or less over there, make a U-turn, like 3 kilometers one way, so 6 kilometers in total of a U-turn, and then go right to proceed. So instead, it takes completely different streets and goes like this, this, and this. So this is something that you cannot remember. This is something that doesn't make absolutely any sense. And so we had a bus service that had 9 people boarding, 9 people boarding a bus a day at a particular bus stop, and these bus stops were many. You see 5, 10, 17, 14, 22, 34. Doesn't make absolutely any sense for a bus service, but this bus service could not have been improved before the road circulation was revised to allow the buses do a more feasible pattern. Interchanges have to be taken seriously. I gave you an example of a ride that requires just one interchange. In my daily commute, I make 4 interchanges. So my ride during the morning peak, it takes 80 to 90 minutes. During the after peak in the late afternoon, it takes more than 2 hours, just because I have to wait for the train, not just for a couple of minutes, but for 10 minutes, and I have 4 interchanges. So 10 minutes per 4 interchanges becomes 40 additional minutes to my travel time. So interchanges have to be done well, not only because of these frequency issues, but also because of the walking issues. So you have to have a most direct walking access between different public transport lines. So this is a nice example from Budapest. This is from Zurich, Switzerland. This is from Lodz, Poland, and this is from Moscow, Russia. The one we just did in 2016 in Lower Kitai-Gorod. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a large piece of infrastructure. Infrastructure is not that important. What is important is service and ability of providing a good service. So a decent layout of a public square with just several nice bus stops and tram stops located in proper locations can do the trick, can do the job, can make public transport much more efficient than it currently is. And eventually we come to the Moscow bus network revision. So everything that I was telling you about was considered when we were doing the redesign. So the initial redesign looked like an explosion on a spaghetti factory. So you can see a lot of routes doing some strange things around here and there, all the one-way patterns that are impossible to remember, but also that take too much time to travel around, so nobody was really using the buses because the buses were not convenient to use. All this, with nearly the same amount of buses, was substituted with this. Through a road network revision, through public transport network revision, through all the measures that I was talking about, it was revised from this to this, with the ridership increase from 385,000 people a day into 540,000 people a day, and it keeps growing. So when you make public transportation useful, you get something like this. You see, this is a ridership curve. And it's not the only example. There are many more examples now. As you may know, if anybody follows the public transport developments, the city of Auckland in New Zealand have just implemented the new bus network, and they're doing the expansion of the rail service. And they have the curve that looks more or less the same. When you make public transportation useful, people start using it. And that's eventually the ultimate goal, because this is how we can make as many people as possible travel to as many destinations as possible. So what's the point? Transportation defines what we can do and what we cannot do in our lives. It defines it through taking our time for traveling from A to B. So we need to improve our transportation in order to take control of our lives, in order to take more opportunity from our cities. We need a fast, reliable, safe, accessible, affordable service which allows as many people as possible get to as many places as possible, because more access brings more opportunity. The more we have the opportunities, the more we have the choice. And the more the choice, the more we have our personal freedom. Thank you very much for your attention. And before Richard grabs the mic and we go to question and answer session, just a small advertising. As you may know, I work for the Mobility and Chain Bureau that does transport planning for cities and master plans all over the world. And because they permitted me to leave the office for a couple of days, I was able to get here and to present this talk. Thanks to them. So if you need a transport plan, please feel free to drop me a call. That's about it. Thank you very much for your attention and question and answers, right?
Questions, yes. I get the first question. Haha. So I was wondering about redoing a bus network.
Yeah.
I'm sure you heard recently Jarrett Walker is in the process of redoing Dublin,
He was
or
also in the process of Moscow as well.
okay. And if I'm not mistaken, he got a lot of negative reaction to some of the proposals in Dublin. How do you deal with people who are, the 5 people who get on that bus every day? They're not a lot of people, but all of a sudden it's a different route and they're angry. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, actually, you hit the points because those guys were the guys who sent most of the complaints. So that was the service that we canceled, and we got most of complaints from them. So no, the point is that, as I mentioned before, the way transportation works, it affects our lives, and we as human beings, we don't like changes, especially when these changes affect our lives so drastically. So whenever you change anything, absolutely anything related to public transportation, you're going to get thousands of complaints, like thousands of complaints. When you're doing a bus network, a public transport network revision, you're going to have people standing at your door. If you're a decision maker, if you're a city official, you're going to have a queue of people standing at your door, willing to tell you how you screwed up their lives, and they're going to bring you their parents, an old grandma, disabled in a wheelchair, and they're going to show you to her. They're going to introduce you, and they're going to point at you, and they're going to tell you this is the guy who screwed up her life. So this is how it's going to happen. This is how it happens all the time. So in order to be able to deal with this, you have to run a very extensive communication campaign. You have to involve people during the design phase. You have to speak to the community. You have to understand what the desires of the community are. You also have to understand. You also have to be able to convey the message of what you are doing, and that was part of the plan in Moscow. So we ran a large information campaign. We were telling people that this has to be done because there are many issues, and there were various forms of sending feedback and so on and so forth. And we managed to do it. I think it was easier for us to do it because in the city center there were, parts of the previous service were so useless that nobody was using them. So it was the easiest part, to change these. But yeah, you're going to get a lot of negative feedback. You have to be ready for that, and you have to be brave enough to withstand that and to talk to the community and to explain what you're doing and why it is necessary.
I've got 2 questions. One is, can you tell us more about the changes that you've made to the roads to make the network work?
Yeah.
And the second question would be, what was the impact of the new mapping to promoting the new services?
Right. So I think there are several points in it. So long story short, with the infrastructure, there were several places where we had issues like this. For instance, so the bus that was coming into the city center, we were not able to make it because the only circulation pattern that was allowed by the traffic management scheme was that you go right, you make a U-turn, you go here, you make another U-turn, and you go back. So there was no other way of providing a bus service just because the traffic management scheme was designed this way. So in some cases, like this one, for instance, this one was changed into this one. We installed public transport only traffic lights. We provided bus dedicated lanes. Some of them counterflow. Some of them go through pedestrian areas. Some, there are many different design solutions. The point is that public transport was allowed to ignore the traffic scheme, and it was provided with many maneuvers, opportunities, corner cuts were necessary in order to provide the service that makes sense. What is important is that when you are doing the redesign of the service, you have to deliberately ignore all the limitations of your infrastructure first. You have to design the service regardless of public transport modes you have. You have to design a service that makes sense as a network. And then, when you have the final plan, and we have the final plan, we have the vision where the city is still going to. There are still a couple of things that have to be introduced. So when you have the final vision, then based on this vision, you can develop the infrastructure plan to change the streets, to add the public transport lanes, to build the tram tracks if necessary, to do whatever needs to be done with infrastructure. And then based on your budget capabilities, you are able to prioritize these infrastructure measures and to do the return of your investment analysis, to prioritize what has to be done first, what can be done later. Things have to be separable. There's no ideal plan. There's always something that you have to leave for the future, and there's something that you can do immediately. The point is that you have to move steadily, even if through stages. You have to move steadily towards the vision, and each step you make has to make much more sense than what you had before you did the step. So I think that is the answer, the general answer. So there are many places like this spot here, or this spot here. The 6 was doing this. What I was explaining, it was doing like this. Now the 6 is running like this. So you see most of the lines here are straight lines, as you may see. They're straight, they're frequent. I think the important point when we come to the mapping issue, I think the important point was that the service plan defined that some services will have to be frequent all day long, and some other services will not have to be frequent all day long, or will not have to be frequent at all. So there are services that build the backbone of the network, and all of them are frequent and as straight as possible. So these services are depicted with thick lines. So you can see these lines in color, in different colors. The color selection was a process that was specifically linked to local understanding of the city. I will not be going into too many details of that, but basically it more or less relates to the metro line that goes more or less nearby. But there were some specifics about selections, and so you have these lines, and then you have some supplementary services, because as you cannot bring the metro to almost every single doorstep, even though we are in Paris, where this has almost been achieved, you cannot also bring to every single doorstep a major bus service. So you have to have some supplementary services that go to some areas where there are not so many people, but still have to be served. So the blue ones are running at 15-minute frequency, and the pink ones that are mostly oriented for some local social needs and whatever kind of very specific purposes, they're running generally a 30-minute frequency. All these has been communicated through a map. This was the first map of this kind in Russia. That was an official public transport map that was showing the frequency of public transport service. So not only the line plan, not only the network structure, but also the frequency. So if you're taking one of these colorful lines, you can be sure that the bus is always coming soon. You don't have to consult with the schedule. So that's the point. I think that's the most important part of the mapping. And of course, during the design process, we were also using a lot of maps. And there's a lot of you put a map on the table and you draw a lot of things, sketches and design solutions. And when you're preparing those, you also use this kind of system. So you use the frequency-based system, because depending on the frequency and the length of the line and the span of the service, you need a certain amount of buses to provide the service, and we have a limited amount of buses and a limited amount of drivers. So we have to find a balance, and we have to understand what has to be frequent, what has to remain not so frequent, because the amount of buses is limited. So we cannot put more buses than we have.
Anyone else?
Thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering, because you are working on a very dense network, perhaps you have noticed that Olivier Vacheret has announced that the Paris network would change on April 20th.
Yeah.
So be there.
Okay. But do you want me to take care of all the blame?
No.
Okay.
The question is that the numbering of the network didn't change,
Yeah.
So there are 5 more lines, 3 lines merged with others. So no system, no other system. There was a dream before, I would say several years ago, to do perhaps like Munich or like Berlin with
Right.
the Metrobusse or like Snellbus in Copenhagen. So hierarchized numbering
Yeah.
and coding of the lines, but it didn't. It was not done yet. Perhaps one day. So, but when you do that in mid-sized cities, you can like here make thicker the important lines, thinner the medium lines, and very thin the local lines. So you can design that, you can show that on the map. When the network is too dense, there is a limit because there are many important lines in very dense places, and it bothers completely the legibility of the map. So there is a balance to do between doing that, hierarchizing that, and showing that. Did you cope this type of situation in some other places?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a part of Department of Transport, unfortunately, so I cannot tell you for the entire city. There are definitely places in Moscow where you have this kind of issue, but normally, when you have too many lines in a certain place, unless this is a major node, like some nodes in Paris, unless it's a major node, then maybe you have a problem with the network. You have too many lines. So this can be one sign of the necessary further potential for the network revision. If you have too many lines and there's a legibility problem, there are many ways out. So you can group the lines by direction. So you can show with one line several services. I think like Yug did on the Luxembourg map, so that he shows through the city center the lines that are grouped in colors depending on where the lines are going through which parts of the city, and then they split. And so you can be inventive about that. But also, I mean, you can split the map in parts effectively. For instance, this is the map that you can find on any bus stop in the city center, and it shows the city center and a little bit of outlying areas, because the vast majority of the users are not going to go much outside this map with a bus. They will take the metro. In that case, metro makes more sense. So that's why this map doesn't show the entire city of Moscow, but it shows only the part for which it was designed. So all types of communication have their advantages and disadvantages, and they have to be tested locally, also against the language, the culture, and other particularities. You know better than me. I mean, you know this very well. With regards to the bus numbers, we did the same thing as they did in Munich and Berlin. So in the initial network, we had all these. We also have another problem, because in in Soviet culture, different modes had the same numbers. So in Russia, normally bus number 1 and trolleybus number 1 are two different routes. So you have to keep in mind the technology, not only the route number, and sometimes they overlap. And since Moscow got rid of trolleybuses in the city center, we got 225s, 339s, and all that kind of mess. So if we were to keep the numbers, we would have had 1663, T25, 158, T45, 144C, and many other numbers that you cannot remember. The part of the communication campaign was that we're creating something completely new. We're opening a new opportunity. So this new opportunity would have a sub-brand. We call it Magistral. Like a word that can be applied to a major public transport system or a major road when you're speaking Russian. So this is a good kind of good communication idea. And so all the main public transport routes in the city center, they now have the numbers M1 to M10. So M1, M2, M3, M4, etc. And we tend to think, but I don't know if eventually this was double checked after some time after the implementation. But we tend to think this helped the communication. Like if you're in the city center, you are taking the primary bus service is going to be M1 to M10 with a couple of exceptions for a variety of reasons. But so we did the same, and we hope it worked.
Thank you. Earlier in the talk, you also mentioned intermodality, like
Yeah, multimodal transport.
multimodal transport. How does, for example, like the metro network involved, like the redesign of the route and also like the design of the map?
Yeah, that's a cool, that's a good question. Thank you very much. I don't have a good representation of this issue, the one that I would have shown at this presentation. Maybe I should have prepared one. But yeah, the idea was that the metro network, you can double check this with the Moscow metro map, but now you have to take my word as granted. The metro network has some shortcomings in it. Like some interchanges were never built. So, for instance, if you're traveling between the orange and the gray line, you have a problem. If you're traveling between the dark blue line and the purple line, you have a problem because there's no direct interchange, and the most direct route lies through a circle line that has many design issues, and so it takes a lot of time, and everybody's complaining about that, and people generally try to avoid this kind of movements around the city, but you can do as much. So some of these buses, they were designed to cover this gap, and in order to provide better connections between the parts of the city that are not well reachable with the metro. Also, has to be said that even though we have a lot of metro stations in the city center of Moscow, they're still much farther away than what you can see in most European cities, especially Paris. So we have about one third of the city center number. This number is not accurate, but about one third of the city center is of the area within this ring is farther from a nearest metro station than 800 meters. So there is a reasonable demand for internal movement without the metro, because, for instance, if you were to go from here, from Tsvetnoy Boulevard to the Bolshoi over here, before the bus came, the quickest option would have been walking, because you have to take the metro for 2 stations with 1 interchange. All of them are deep level, so you have to spend 3 minutes to go down, 2 minutes to wait for a train. You ride for 3 minutes, you make 2-3 minutes of a change, you ride another 3 minutes, and it takes you 5 minutes to get up. And this is only if you're traveling right between the 2 metro stations. But normally your origin and destination would be somewhere around these metro stations, but not directly in direct proximity. So you will also have to walk. So eventually walking was faster. And there were some other connections where it works, like the one here, for instance, between Kropotkinskaya and Arbatskaya is just two bus stops. So taking a bus or walking is much faster than riding a metro, which would require you go to the city center and go back.
Anyone else?
No questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ilya.
Thank you very much.